All right, so today's lecture was on the World War I battlefronts. So again, you should be editing your lecture notes as we go along. So your first topic should really be the Schlieffen Plan goes wrong. Um, Remember, that's Germany's plan to not fight a two-front war. So in August 1914, Germany invaded Belgium as part of the Schlieffen Plan. And that's something that we've talked about previously, so I won't go into details. They believed they had 6 weeks before Russia could mobilize and put an army in the field. So Germany planned to defeat France quickly, and they thought they had 6 weeks to do it, and they put most of their army on the Western Front. And to get to France, they went through Belgium because most of the French army was between the French and German borders. Now, the Schlieffen Plan went wrong. Things did not work out the way Germany planned because of three surprises. The first surprise is that the Belgians slowed them down. So Germany thought they could just march through Belgium and invade France with no resistance from the Belgians. But instead, the Belgians fought back, which slowed the German army down. So that's the first surprise. The second surprise is that the British sent an army into France, which Germany did not expect. So remember, Belgium and the British were allies. So when Belgium was attacked by Germany or invaded by Germany, that brought Britain into the war and against the Germans. So the British sent an army into France, which Germany did not expect. So now Germany was fighting two armies instead of one, and they had that timetable of 6 weeks to defeat them. The third surprise is the Russians managed to get an army into the field more quickly than expected, which threatened the Junkers home area in East Prussia. So remember, the Junkers were the German officers who also ran the agricultural farms in East Prussia. So the German army panicked a little bit, and they sent back some of their troops to help defend Eastern Germany or Prussia. So again, three kind of surprises that Germany didn't expect that made it harder for them to successfully complete the Schlieffen Plan in 6 weeks. Again, Russia didn't take as long. They were fighting two armies in France instead of just the French, and then the Belgians slowed them down. So they were not able to successfully complete the Schlieffen Plan. And I'm actually going to skip ahead to a map. So now your next subtopic should be Western Front. So in September 1914, the British and the French were able to stop the German advance just outside of Paris at the First Battle of the Marne. So up until then, about a month into the war, Germany was marching through Belgium, marching through France. Nothing was stopping them, and then the British and the French were able to stop them. And that kind of it was a major turning point in the war, again, because they stopped the German advance, and they set up this stalemate where the front line never really moved for the next 4 years. So on the map, you can see the yellow line, that's the front, and it doesn't really move until like 1917. So the Allies, the British and the French, won, and there's no hope for a quick victory for the Germans. So this is kind of why the Schlieffen Plan really falls apart. And this is also where the Miracle of the Marne takes place. So the Miracle of the Marne saves Paris from the German onslaught. 600 taxi cabs were used to bring 6,000 soldiers to the front at the last minute, which kind of helped boost the forces. And again, after this, the Western front lines hardened, and neither side really advances much for the next 4 years. Okay. Oops, did not mean to do that yet. Sorry, guys. All right, so we're going to talk about a few other things related to the Western Front. The defensive strategy and technology led to high casualties. So again, that defensive strategy of build a trench and hold the line led to a lot of casualties, and that kind of contributed to the front line not really moving one way or another. And then the other contribution to the high casualties was the technology. So for example, the machine gun. So one man with a machine gun can stop a much larger group and create heavy casualties without much advancement. So no real advance, but incredibly high casualties. And the two battles we're going to look at are the Battle of Verdun and the Battle of the Somme. So the Battle of Verdun, it's Verdun, took place from February to December in 1916. It was one of the largest and longest battles between French and German troops. And it happened because in 1916, the Germans tried to advance by taking the French fortress of Verdun. There were a combined casualties of over 1 million men. And eventually, after 11 months of fighting, the Germans decided they didn't really need the fortress that much because it wasn't really, they weren't getting it easily and it wasn't going to make that much of a difference. So again, 1 million men die at the Battle of Verdun. The second major battle is the Battle of the Somme. That's Somme. And this took place from July to November of 2016. And it's a really great example of how trench warfare really impacted World War I. So the British were trying to advance and break through German lines at the Somme. Over 3 million men were fighting and over 1 million men died. So about a third of the men fighting died. There was no real gain. So this battle is symbolic of what was happening on the Western Front, where you have massive battles, no gains, no real decisive winner. It's also the first battle that fought with tanks. So tanks were great, except they could only go about 4 miles an hour, and they tended to break down. But the Somme is just it's a terrible example of the trench warfare and how that impacted morale during the war. All right, and now the people who started the war. Oops. So we've got Serbia. You can see below Austria-Hungary. Remember, Serbia funded the Black Hand assassins that took out the heir to the Austrian throne, which then led to Austria-Hungary declaring war on Serbia. Well, during the war, the Serbians pushed the Austrians back out of Serbia twice before finally losing. And then 1/6 of all Serbians died during the war. So that's 1/6 of all Serbians, not just soldiers, but also civilians. So it was very hard on the Serbians. There were heavy civilian casualties. And then we're going to shift gears to the Eastern Front, which is between Germany and Russia. So the Germans were able to defeat the Russians on the Eastern Front after 3 years because Russia was less technologically advanced. So kind of recapping the Eastern Front, over 1 million Russians were killed, over 1 million Russians were taken prisoner. Russian men were sent to the front without guns or with only 3 bolts a day. And there's sort of that story of the Russians sending 3 men and 1 gun to the front lines, or for every 3 men, 1 gun. It really just highlights how they were not prepared for war, and they couldn't be prepared because of how unadvanced they were. And during the war, the Russians ran out of food, weapons, and ammunition, which eventually leads to kind of Russian frustration. And then we get to the end of the war. So the end of the war, by 1917, soldiers and civilians on both sides were frustrated by the lack of progress, shortages, and heavy casualties. There was also the emotional impact of the deaths and of the maiming of young men for nothing, because again, the front line really didn't move on the Western Front for 4 years. And this frustration led to some major incidents. First, in the French army, there were a lot of mutinies where men would refuse to go over the top. These mutinies were brutally put down, and about 50 men were probably 50 men were executed as a warning to others to not mutiny. And this affected about half the French army. In Russia, the Russians revolted and overthrew the Tsar, and we'll talk about this next unit more in depth. In Austria, remember all of the different ethnic groups in the Austrian and Hungarian Empire, those ethnic groups began to revolt against Austria. And then in 1917, the Russians pull out of the war. So the end of the war on the Eastern Front, the Russians signed a peace treaty with Germany in early 1918. So the Russians are officially out, and again, we'll kind of talk about what that looks like in the Russian Revolution. The new leaders of the Russian government say that they didn't really want to go to war in the first place, so that's why they can break off the treaties and sign their own peace treaty with Germany. What this does is it allows Germany to focus solely on the Western Front, which is intimidating to France and Britain because they, at the time being, they were at a stalemate with Germany on the Western Front. But now Germany can fully focus on the Western Front, except that the impact of the American troops. So at this point in 1917, America or the United States gets involved in World War I. And by early 1918, the American troops in France were beginning to have an impact. And again, if you think about it, the Europeans had been fighting this war for 3 years now. They're jaded. They've seen war. It's not this exciting new thing. They're sick of trench warfare. Morale is incredibly low. They've lost millions of lives. And then the Americans come in and kind of have this new, fresh attitude because they haven't experienced what the Europeans have just been through. So they kind of become the tiebreakers, and obviously they come into the side of the British and the French. And eventually, the war on the Western Front ends in November 1918. So riots start breaking out in Germany, and the German government decides to give up rather than risk a revolution. So the Russian Revolution is kind of like the start of communism, or not, well, not the start, but the new government is a communist government, and it's starting to spread towards other parts of Europe. And Germany does not want to become communist, so their government signs a peace treaty rather than risk a revolution. So on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918, the war officially ends with the armistice. So again, that's November 11th, 11 a.m. 1918. Both sides officially stop fighting, and we'll get into the Treaty of Versailles later on. But that is the end of the war. Again, later on this week, we will look at different sources and videos to kind of pick apart what life was like for a soldier on the front line in World War I. And then we have the sources.